In the historic heart of Boston, where cobblestone alleys whisper tales of revolution and glass skyscrapers reflect the ambitions of a new age, a story of buried secrets and improbable fate was about to be resurrected. The stage was set at Aura, a restaurant perched atop the Sterling Tower, so exclusive its reservations were the stuff of legend. Here fortunes were discussed over dry-aged steak, and power was brokered with the clinking of crystal glasses. The players in this drama were a reclusive billionaire, a man who commanded a global shipping empire, and a young waitress, a ghost in the machine of the city, whose only ambition was to make it to the end of the month. She was about to utter 9 simple words, 9 words that would shatter 2 decades of silence, expose a meticulously crafted lie, and dredge a long-forgotten tragedy from the depths of the Atlantic. Her observation was born of pure coincidence, but for the billionaire, it would land with the force of a tidal wave, triggering a collapse that would change everything. The air in Aura was different. It was a rarefied atmosphere, scrubbed clean of the city's exhaust and anxiety, leaving only the subtle sense of truffle oil, vintage leather, and expensive success. For 22-year-old Clara Evans, it was a gilded cage she was allowed to polish, but never inhabit. For 40 hours a week, she exchanged her scuffed Converse for sensible, polished black loafers, her frayed artist smock for a crisp, monogrammed uniform, and her own quiet personality for one of unobtrusive efficiency. Her real life was a world away in a small, drafty 2-bedroom apartment in Somerville, where the air smelled of her mother's chamomile tea and the linseed oil from her own half-finished canvases. Her mother, Elena, was the quiet center of her world, a woman of gentle disposition and fragile health. Her eyes held a perpetual mist of confusion, a look of someone constantly trying to recall the title of a song stuck in her head. For as long as Clara could remember, her mother had been plagued by debilitating migraines and significant memory loss. The doctors had attributed it to the trauma of a boating accident she'd survived long before Clara was born. Elena had been found on the shore of a small coastal town, waterlogged and disoriented, with no memory of her life before that moment. The authorities gave her a name, and she painstakingly built a new small world around it. Their most cherished heirloom, the sole tangible link to the life that had been stolen from her, was a locket Elena wore on a delicate silver chain, always tucked beneath her collar. It was a singular, exquisite piece, a sterling silver compass rose, the cardinal points marked by tiny sapphire chips. On the back, an intricate, unique engraving swirled around a single phrase, Ancora imparo. Yet I am learning. Elena confessed it felt like a part of her, a phantom limb of her soul, even though she couldn't remember who had fastened it around her neck. For Clara, the locket was the central clue in a cold case she had no idea how to solve, a beautiful, frustrating symbol of the great unknown that defined their lives. Tonight, Clara's section included the enigmatic titan, Julian Croft. He was a man who didn't just move through the world, he charted its course. Croft Maritime was a global leviathan, its fleet of supertankers and cargo ships, the lifeblood of international trade. The financial press called him the Mariner, a nod to his industry and his reclusive, solitary nature. Whispers followed him, rumors of a profound personal tragedy 20 years prior that had transformed him from a charismatic visionary into a hollowed-out workaholic. He sat alone at the best table, a corner booth with a panoramic view of the glittering Boston skyline, a king in a self-imposed exile. He was in his late 40s, with a handsome but severe face, eyes the color of a stormy sea that missed nothing, and an air of such profound, icy grief that the senior staff steered clear of his table, leaving the billionaire to the new girl. Clara approached with the practiced poise she didn't feel, her notepad a shield against his palpable intensity. "Good evening, sir. Can I get you something from the bar to begin?" Julian Croft didn't bother to look up from the tablet displaying stock market data. "Macallan 25, 2 fingers, no ice." His voice was a low rumble, dismissive and final. The entire service was an exercise in invisibility. He consumed his meal with a mechanical precision, his eyes never straying from the screen, his posture rigid and unapproachable. Clara was merely a function, a pair of hands that delivered his steak and refilled his scotch. She was clearing his main course when her sleeve caught the edge of his water glass, causing a slight spill. "My apologies, sir," she stammered, quickly dabbing the linen with a napkin. He finally looked up, his expression a mask of cold irritation. But his gaze didn't land on her face. It snagged on her neck. The fine silver chain of her own locket, a birthday gift from her mother, had slipped out from beneath her uniform. It was an exact, perfect replica of Elena's, commissioned from a local artisan as a symbol of their shared mystery and unbreakable bond. So a piece of her mother's past would always guide her. Julian Croft's steak knife clattered onto his plate. The sharp sound cut through the restaurant's muted ambiance like a gunshot. His body went ramrod straight. The color drained from his face, leaving a sickly, ashen pallor under the warm, recessed lighting. His piercing, sea-gray eyes were locked onto the small silver compass rose against Clara's collarbone. A look of raw, violent shock twisted his features. He wasn't looking at a piece of jewelry. He was staring at a ghost. The silence at the table became a physical presence, heavy and suffocating. Clara froze, a deer in the headlights. Her training manual was screaming at her to apologize, to fade back into the wallpaper, to become invisible again. But she couldn't move. She was pinned by the sheer, agonizing force of his stare. It wasn't anger. It was something far more primal, something broken. His eyes, wide with a terrible dawning disbelief, finally lifted from her locket to her face. He was truly seeing her for the first time, his gaze sweeping over her features, her dark wavy hair, the curve of her jaw, the shape of her eyes with a desperate, frantic intensity, like a drowning man searching for a piece of wreckage in a storm. Confused and genuinely frightened, Clara felt a nervous tremor run through her. She had to say something, anything, to break the terrifying spell that had fallen over them. She managed a small, uncertain smile. "It's a unique design, isn't it?" she began, her voice barely a whisper. She instinctively touched the locket, a comforting, familiar gesture. Wanting to fill the silence, to connect with this terrifyingly powerful man on some human level, she added the 9 words that would detonate her life. "Sir, it's a compass. My mom has one too." The words hung in the air, seemingly innocent, yet cataclysmic. For Julian Croft, the carefully constructed seawalls he had built around his heart for 20 years were breached, and a tsunami of grief and memory came roaring in. The blood vanished from his face, and his breath hitched in a ragged, audible gasp. "What? What did you just say?" he rasped, his voice a shattered, unrecognizable thing. "My mother," Clara repeated, her own confidence dissolving under his horrifying scrutiny. "She has a locket just like it. It's the only thing she has from before her accident." Julian's hand shot out, not to grab her, but as if to brace himself against an invisible impact. His fingers were trembling violently. His gaze was no longer on the locket, but locked on Clara's eyes, a hurricane of pain, confusion, and a terrifying, impossible hope swirling in their depths. "Your mother," he stammered, the words catching in his throat. "Her name. Tell me her name." Before Clara could form a reply, his body gave out. His eyes rolled back in his head. A choked, strangled sound escaped his lips, and he slumped forward, his head cracking against the table with a sickening thud that sent silverware skittering. He then slid sideways, his large frame collapsing from the chair and onto the plush designer carpet with a heavy, final finality. Panic erupted. The curated elegance of Aura shattered into a million pieces of raw, primal fear. The manager, a perpetually stressed man named David, sprinted over, his face a mask of pure terror. "Call 911. Somebody call an ambulance now." Staff and patrons surged toward the table. Clara was shoved aside in the ensuing chaos, stumbling backward, her mind a maelstrom of confusion and horror. One moment she was a waitress making awkward small talk. The next, a billionaire was lying unconscious at her feet. What had happened? What had she said? The image of his face, the raw agony in his eyes in the second before he fell, was seared into her memory. As paramedics rushed in, expertly moving through the crowd and strapping Julian Croft to a gurney. A sharp-faced man in an impeccably tailored suit who had been dining across the room took command. This was Marcus Thorne, Croft Maritime's chief counsel and Julian's closest confidant. He barked orders into his phone, his expression grim and controlled. His calculating eyes swept the scene and landed on Clara, who was being interrogated by a frantic David. "What did you say to him? What did you do?" The manager hissed, his entire career flashing before his eyes. "Nothing, I mentioned my locket," Clara stammered, holding up the small silver charm as if it were Exhibit A in a trial she didn't understand. Marcus Thorne overheard. He strode over, his authoritative presence instantly silencing the sputtering manager. He gave Clara a long, appraising look, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second on the compass rose. He didn't speak to her. He simply pulled a sleek business card from his wallet and pressed it into David's hand. "Get me all of her information," Thorne commanded, his voice a low, steely whisper. "Name, address, next of kin. I want it on my desk in an hour, and she is to be placed on indefinite leave, effective immediately." Then he was gone, following the gurney out into the night, leaving Clara standing in the wreckage of her evening. The tiny silver compass rose on her neck, feeling impossibly heavy, like the weight of a world she never knew existed. The subsequent 48 hours passed in a fog of anxiety and confusion for Clara. Her suspension from Aura was immediate and absolute, the message delivered via a curt, impersonal text from her manager. She was a loose end, a problem to be contained. The incident dominated the financial news cycle. "Billionaire Julian Croft collapses at Aura," the headlines blared. Speculation was rampant. A stroke, a heart attack, burnout from a recent hostile takeover. There was no mention of a waitress or a piece of jewelry. Clara Evans had been surgically excised from the official story, yet she felt like the epicenter of an earthquake she couldn't comprehend. She spent her days in the quiet Somerville apartment, hovering over her mother. Elena, blessedly oblivious, saw the news of the billionaire's collapse as a distant tragedy in a world that rarely intersected with her own. She was more concerned with a new pest on her prize-winning orchids. Clara watched her mother tracing the familiar, gentle lines of her face and tried to reconcile this fragile woman with the violent, visceral reaction of the most powerful man she had ever encountered. It was an impossible equation. Her mother was Elena Evans, a woman who found solace in the quiet rustle of book pages and the scent of brewing tea. She wore the compass rose locket tucked beneath her sweater, a private treasure held close to her heart. When Clara gently prodded her about it again, Elena simply offered her sad, wistful smile. "I don't know its story, my love," she said, her fingers instinctively tracing the engraved motto. "But when I woke up in that hospital, it was the only thing I owned. It felt solid. It felt like it knew the way, even when I didn't." On the third day, the summons arrived. It wasn't a phone call or an email. It was a black sedan, as sleek and silent as a shark, that slid to a stop in front of their aging brick building. A driver in a crisp uniform knocked on their door, hat in hand. He politely but firmly informed Ms. Clara Evans that Mr. Thorne required her presence at Massachusetts General Hospital. It was phrased as a request, but the tone made it clear that refusal was not an option. The journey to the hospital was like traveling to a foreign country. The car's plush leather interior smelled of wealth and insulation. The city's symphony of sirens and traffic was muted to a distant, respectful hum. Clara felt like a specimen under glass, her slightly worn jacket a glaring contrast to the polished, powerful world she was being pulled into. She was escorted not to the public entrance, but to a private wing, a place where the city's elite came to heal in serene, suite-like rooms with concierge service. Marcus Thorne met her at the elevator. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and possessed the unnerving calm of a man who diffused crises for a living. "Ms. Evans," he said, his voice a carefully modulated instrument of neutrality. "Thank you for coming. Mr. Croft is stable and awake. He has been insistent on speaking with you." He led her down a hushed, carpeted corridor to a large mahogany door, guarded by a discreet but imposing security guard. "A word of caution," Thorne said, pausing before they entered. "He is still weak. The doctors have confirmed it was not cardiac. It was a severe psychosomatic shock event, an extreme panic attack. Clara's heart pounded against her ribs. I still don't understand why. What did I say? Thorne stopped and gave her a long, analytical look. That is what we are all hoping you can help us understand. You mentioned your mother's locket. For reasons he has not yet shared, Mr. Croft has a profound interest in it. Before you speak with him, you must know one thing. The man you are about to see is not the man the world knows. He has not been whole since his wife, Isabella, was lost at sea in a boating accident 20 years ago. He is a man haunted by ghosts. Tread carefully. He opened the door and ushered her inside. The hospital suite was more like a luxury hotel room, with a sitting area, a kitchenette, and a stunning view of the Charles River. Julian Croft was not in bed. He was sitting in a large armchair by the window, wearing silk pajamas and a cashmere robe. He was connected to a silent IV drip, and a small monitor traced his heart rate with a steady, quiet rhythm. He looked older, more fragile than he had at the restaurant. The armor of icy indifference had been shattered, replaced by a raw, aching vulnerability. His eyes, however, burned with a desperate fire as they locked onto hers. Ms. Evans, he said, his voice raspy but firm. Please, sit. Clara moved cautiously, perching on the edge of a chair opposite him, her hands twisted into a knot in her lap. The locket, he said, the words strained, fragile. You said your mother has one. Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Where did she get it? He pressed, leaning forward, his entire being seemingly focused on her answer. She doesn't know, Clara said softly. She's had it as long as I can remember. She has amnesia. From an accident. A boating accident, they think. It was over 20 years ago. Julian Croft's breath hitched. He squeezed his eyes shut, a wave of profound pain washing over his face. An accident, he whispered, the words tasting like poison. He opened his eyes again, and they were glistening with unshed tears. That locket, I designed it. I commissioned 2 identical pieces. There are only 2 in the entire world. I designed them for my wife, Isabella, for our 5th anniversary. The compass rose. She was my true north. I put it on her neck myself. He took a ragged, shuddering breath, the heart monitor beeping a fraction faster. She was wearing it the day she disappeared. Her sailboat, it was caught in a sudden storm off the coast of Cape Cod. They found the wreckage, pieces of the hull, a sail, but they never found her. The locket was never recovered. He looked at Clara, his gaze so saturated with a desperate, impossible hope that it was physically painful to behold. Ms. Evans, he pleaded, his voice breaking completely. Please, I have to see it. I have to meet your mother. The air in the sterile, luxurious hospital suite grew thick with the weight of unspoken grief and impossible questions. Clara stared at Julian Croft, her mind a frantic scramble of thoughts. Isabella. The name was a ghost in the room, summoned by the description of a silver locket. But her mother was Elena. It had to be a mistake, a cruel, heartbreaking coincidence. Sir. Mr. Croft, Clara began, her voice trembling with a mixture of pity and a fierce, protective instinct for her mother. I am so deeply sorry for your loss, truly. But I think this is a misunderstanding. My mother's name is Elena Evans, not Isabella. Julian flinched as if she had physically struck him. The nascent hope in his eyes flickered, assaulted by doubt. Elena, he repeated, the name foreign and jarring on his tongue. No, it can't be. The locket, that engraving. Ancora imparo. It was our motto, a private joke from our first trip to Florence. He leaned back, the energy seeming to seep out of him, leaving him looking frail and old. The heart monitor's steady rhythm faltered, becoming slightly more erratic. Marcus Thorne, who had been a silent, imposing statue by the door, took a half-step forward, his expression a mask of concern. Julian, perhaps that's enough for now. No, Julian shot back, his voice regaining a sliver of its command. He fixed his gaze back on Clara, his eyes pleading. Just tell me about her, about this accident. When was it? Where did it happen? A knot of dread tightened in Clara's stomach. I don't know everything. She doesn't either. It's a blank wall for her. She just remembers waking up in a small clinic in a town called Port Blossom. It's a tiny fishing village on the coast. It was about 20 years ago. The people there were the ones who named her Elena. She had no ID, no wallet, no memory of who she was or how she ended up on their shore. They said she was the sole survivor of a small boat that had been torn apart in a storm. Every word Clara spoke was a piece of a puzzle Julian had stopped trying to solve 2 decades ago. The coast, a storm, 20 years ago. His wife Isabella had been sailing from Nantucket to Boston. The wreckage had been found scattered. Port Blossom was a small, overlooked harbor town exactly in the path of that storm. Port Blossom, he whispered, the name tasting like salt and rust. His mind, the same ruthlessly logical machine that ran a global empire, was now racing, connecting dots that seemed too fantastical to be real. The official report had been painfully clear. A tragic accident, a life lost to the unforgiving Atlantic. He had bankrupted himself funding private search teams that scoured the coastline for months. They found fragments, a piece of her sailbag, but never her. The consensus was that she had been swept out to sea. Is it possible? He murmured, more to himself than to anyone else, his voice filled with a terrifying cocktail of hope and dread. Could she have been washed ashore? Survived? Sir, with all due respect, Clara interjected, her voice firm despite her fear. Her mother's well-being was her primary concern. My mother is not a strong woman. Her life is quiet and fragile. To have you show up, bringing up a past that she cannot remember, a life that might not even be hers, it could shatter her. I understand, Julian said, his voice regaining its focus, its command. I will be the soul of discretion, but I cannot live another second with this ghost of a chance hanging over me. For 20 years, I have been a hollow man. I have been half alive. If there is a 1 in a trillion chance that the woman who raised you is the woman I promised my life to, I have to know. He swiveled his gaze to Marcus Thorne. Marcus, I want everything on Port Blossom. Clinic records, police reports, town archives from 20 years ago. John and Jane Doe admissions. I want the names of every nurse, every fisherman who might have been on the water that day. Spare no expense. I want to know who found her, who treated her, who named her. Thorne nodded, his expression unreadable as he was already typing into his phone. Consider it done, Julian. Julian turned back to Clara, his expression softening into one of pure desperation. Ms. Evans. Clara, I am not asking as a billionaire. I am begging you as a man who has lost his compass. Let me meet her. I won't pressure her. I won't even say the name Isabella. I just need to see her. I need to see the locket in her hands. Clara was torn. Her entire life she had yearned for answers for her mother. She had dreamt of finding a key that could unlock Elena's past and fill in the sad, empty spaces in her history. Now that key was sitting before her, dressed in a cashmere robe, a man of unimaginable power and unimaginable pain. But what if opening that door didn't lead to healing, but to a hurricane that would destroy them both? Yet looking into his eyes, she saw not a corporate titan, but a man utterly lost at sea. It was a look she recognized, a more profound, more tormented version of the same lost look she saw in her mother's eyes every single day. Okay, she finally whispered, the word feeling both momentous and terrifyingly small. Okay, I'll talk to her. I'll set it up, but we do it my way, at our apartment, quietly. No lawyers, no entourage, just you. A single tear, the first he had allowed himself in 2 decades, traced a path down Julian Croft's haggard cheek. Thank you, he breathed, the words carrying the weight of a lifetime of grief. Thank you. Clara left the gilded cage of the private hospital wing and took the rumbling subway back to Somerville, the black sedan having been politely declined. She felt like she was carrying an unexploded bomb, ticking down to a detonation she couldn't predict. When she arrived home, she found her mother dozing in her armchair, a book resting on her chest. The delicate silver chain of the compass rose locket was visible at the hollow of her throat. Driven by a new, frantic urgency, Clara began to search their small apartment for anything, any scrap of a clue she might have overlooked. In the back of her mother's cedar chest, beneath a stack of old quilts, she found a small water-stained cardboard box. She had seen it before, but had always respected her mother's unspoken wish for it to remain closed. Now all bets were off. With trembling fingers, she lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of faded ephemera, a dried sand dollar, a faded ferry ticket to a town she didn't recognize, and at the very bottom, a small yellowed manila envelope. She carefully opened it. Inside were two items. The first was a faded Polaroid photograph. It showed a younger, vibrant woman who was unmistakably her mother, laughing with her head thrown back in pure joy. Her arm was wrapped around a handsome young man with familiar, piercing, sea-gray eyes and a smile that could have lit up the world. A young Julian Croft. They were standing on the deck of a sailboat, the wind catching her hair, and on the silver chain around her neck, gleaming in the sun, was the compass rose locket. Clara's breath caught in her throat, a sharp, painful gasp. The second item in the envelope was a brittle plastic hospital bracelet. The name printed on it was smudged but legible. Jane Doe. The admission date was from just over 20 years ago, and printed in small, faded letters was the name of the facility, Port Blossom Community Clinic. The fragile thread of coincidence snapped. This was real. This was happening. Her mother, Elena Evans, the quiet, gentle woman asleep in the next room, was Isabella Croft, and Clara, the struggling artist and waitress from Somerville, was the daughter of one of the richest, most powerful men in the world. The revelation in the water-stained box sent a seismic shock through Clara's world. She sat on the floor of her bedroom, the Polaroid and the hospital bracelet laid out before her like sacred relics from a life she never knew she was missing. The woman in the photograph was her mother, but a version of her she had never known. Radiant, carefree, and deeply in love. And the man beside her, the smiling, handsome man, was the same one who had collapsed at her feet, a ghost haunted by the memory of this very woman. Her first, overwhelming instinct was to rush into the living room, to wake her mother and show her the proof, to cry out, "You were Isabella! You had a life, a husband! You were loved!" But a glance at Elena's serene, sleeping face stopped her. Her mother's mind was a fragile ecosystem, carefully balanced for 2 decades. Introducing this invasive species, however beautiful, could cause a total collapse. The questions were a swarm in her mind. If her mother was Isabella Croft, a prominent Boston socialite, why was she left as a Jane Doe in a tiny, underfunded clinic? With a husband like Julian Croft, why had no one found her? It didn't make sense. Someone must have wanted her to disappear. Meanwhile, Julian Croft, revitalized by a sliver of hope more potent than any medicine, had unleashed the full, formidable force of his resources. Marcus Thorne, now acting as less of a lawyer and more of a private general, descended on the sleepy town of Port Blossom with a team of investigators. The Port Blossom Community Clinic was now a modern facility, but 20 years ago it had been a small, struggling institution with paper records. A generous 7-figure donation to the clinic's new cardiac wing from a grateful anonymous benefactor unlocked every door and filing cabinet. Marcus's team of forensic accountants and investigators began to reconstruct the events of that fateful week. They found the admission record for a Jane Doe, brought in by a local lobster fisherman who found her clinging to a piece of driftwood. She had a severe head trauma, hypothermia, and profound amnesia. She was the only unidentified patient they had admitted that entire year. The investigation began to pivot when Marcus cross-referenced the clinic's staff and administrative records with Julian's own corporate and financial records from that period. He was hunting for a connection, any link, no matter how tenuous. He found it in the most chillingly familiar of places. The clinic's lead physician at the time, a Dr. Alistair Finch, had taken an abrupt early retirement a year after the incident, citing a sudden, unexpected inheritance. There was no record of any such inheritance. There was, however, a record of a series of wire transfers totaling $3 million, funneled through a labyrinth of offshore accounts. After days of relentless, painstaking work, Marcus's team traced the origin of those accounts to a single source, a subsidiary holding company controlled by none other than Marcus Thorne himself. The discovery hit Marcus's second-in-command, a loyal investigator named Peterson, like a physical blow. He brought the evidence to Marcus, assuming it was a frame-up, a complex bit of corporate sabotage. But Marcus Thorne simply looked at the damning evidence, his face a mask of cold resignation. "It's true," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I did it." The confession that followed was a story of obsession, jealousy, and bitter resentment. Marcus had known Isabella long before Julian had. He had been infatuated with her, but she had only ever seen him as a friend. When she fell in love with Julian, his charismatic, brilliant, and wealthy best friend, Marcus's affection curdled into a dark, possessive jealousy. He had watched their perfect life with a corrosive envy. The boating accident had been a tragic fluke of nature. But when Marcus, who had been coordinating the initial search efforts, received a call from a small clinic in Port Blossom about an amnesiac Jane Doe who matched Isabella's description, he saw an opportunity. It was a twisted, golden chance to correct what he saw as a cosmic injustice. He drove to the clinic alone. He found Isabella alive, but her memory was a complete blank slate. He paid Dr. Finch a life-changing sum of money to create a new identity for her, to ensure she was given a new name and quietly discharged with a fabricated backstory of being a lone drifter. He had buried the records, creating a dead end for any potential search. Isabella Croft, the wife of his rival, would be declared dead, lost to the sea. And he, Marcus, would be there to comfort Julian, to become his indispensable right-hand man, his most trusted friend, forever intertwined with the family he felt should have been his. He had constructed Julian's 20-year-long prison of grief, and he had held the key the entire time. While the story of this ultimate betrayal was being uncovered, Clara was gently preparing her mother. "An old acquaintance is going to visit, Mom," she explained, her voice carefully calm. "Someone from a long time ago. He thinks he may have known you before your accident. Just be open. It might be nothing." Elena was nervous, but the prospect of a visitor from her forgotten life was a powerful lure. She agreed, her hand rarely leaving the compass rose locket, her only anchor. Julian arrived that evening. He didn't come in a limousine, but in a simple black car he'd dismissed a block away. He wore a simple gray sweater and dark slacks, looking not like a billionaire, but like a man on his way to the most important meeting of his life. He carried a small bouquet of wild beach roses. Clara met him at the door. "Her favorite," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. She said they were the only flowers that smelled like freedom. Clara's heart ached for this man, for the lifetime of memories he carried alone. She led him into their small, cozy living room. Elena was sitting in her favorite wingback chair, the soft lamplight warming her features. She looked up as Julian entered. Their eyes met across the small room. For a long, breathless moment, the world stood still. Julian's gaze was a torrent of emotions, drinking in the sight of her, memorizing the new lines on the face he had only seen in his dreams for 20 years. She was older, yes, her hair threaded with distinguished silver, her eyes holding a quiet sadness he didn't recognize. But it was her. It was his Isabella. Elena stared back at the handsome, haunted-looking stranger. She felt a bizarre, powerful pull, a flicker of something deep in the fog of her mind. It wasn't a memory, but the echo of one, a sense of familiarity so profound it made her shiver. Her hand went instinctively to the locket at her throat. Julian saw the gesture. He took a single, hesitant step forward. "Hello," he said, his voice a raw whisper. It's been a very long time." The atmosphere in the small Somerville apartment was charged with the fragile, palpable energy of a dream about to break. Elena clutched the compass rose locket through her blouse, her knuckles white. She looked from the stranger's intensely emotional face to her daughter's worried one, and back again. "I'm sorry," Elena said, her voice soft and hesitant. "Should I know you? You feel familiar." She trailed off, a frustrated sigh escaping her lips. This was the defining narrative of her life, fleeting moments of déjà vu that promised a breakthrough, but always dissolved into mist. Julian's heart both broke and soared. She didn't remember him, not consciously, but her soul did. For now that was enough. It was everything. He held fast to the promise he'd made Clara, reining in the tidal wave of emotion that threatened to crash over him. "My name is Julian," he said, taking another slow, deliberate step into the room. He held out the bouquet of beach roses. "I heard you might like these." Elena looked at the simple, fragrant flowers, and a genuine, surprised smile touched her lips for the first time. She took them, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting second, a spark of static electricity passing between them. She brought them to her nose, inhaling deeply with her eyes closed. "They're lovely," she murmured. "They smell like a bonfire on a dune." A flicker of a memory so faint she couldn't be sure it was real. She looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "How did you know?" "A lucky guess," Julian lied softly, his gaze a tender caress on her face. Clara brought a vase, her movements quiet and unobtrusive, a silent observer at the reunion of two souls. Julian sat on the worn sofa opposite Elena's chair, the space between them feeling both as vast as an ocean and as intimate as a whisper. He didn't push. He didn't demand. He just began to talk. He spoke not of Isabella Croft, the socialite, but of a young woman he once knew. He told stories of her fierce love for sailing, her uncanny ability to find four-leaf clovers, her habit of humming off-key when she painted. He talked about a trip to the Amalfi Coast, a disastrous attempt at making limoncello that ended with them both sticky and laughing. He described a quiet night anchored off the coast of Maine, watching a meteor shower, where he gave her a locket shaped like a compass rose, promising her that as long as they had each other, they'd never be lost. With each story, he wasn't just jogging a memory. He was repainting the portrait of the woman she had been. Clara watched her mother, her heart lodged in her throat. Elena was listening with a rapt, almost childlike attention. She wasn't afraid or confused. Instead, a strange sense of calm seemed to settle over her. These stories, told by this kind, sad-eyed stranger, felt more authentic to her than the 2 decades of hazy, disconnected life she had lived as Elena Evans. "That locket," Elena whispered at last, her eyes downcast, her fingers tracing the familiar shape through her shirt. "The woman you gave it to, you must have loved her very much." "More than the tides," Julian said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "And I still do." Suddenly, Elena's gaze drifted past Julian to a small frame photo on the mantelpiece, a picture of a 5-year-old Clara, grinning with a missing front tooth on her first day of kindergarten. "You have a daughter," Julian said, following her gaze with a soft smile. "She's incredible. You raised a wonderful young woman. She is my whole world," Elena said, her voice filled with a fierce, uncomplicated love. "When I woke up remembering nothing, I was an empty vessel. But then finding out I was going to have her, she gave me a reason to exist. She became my true north." The phrase, "my true north," struck Julian with the force of a physical blow. It was their phrase, the one that had inspired the lockets. In that instant, he understood. Isabella had survived, pregnant and alone. She had given birth to their daughter and raised her in this humble apartment, pouring all the love from her forgotten life into the one precious person she had left. As this delicate reunion was unfolding in Somerville, a far more brutal confrontation was taking place in a glass-walled boardroom downtown. Peterson, the loyal investigator, had bypassed the chain of command and presented his explosive findings directly to Julian's formidable board of directors. He had bank statements, sworn affidavits from the now-retired Dr. Finch, and a recorded confession from Marcus Thorne himself. Marcus was summoned under the guise of an emergency board meeting. He walked in, composed and authoritative, ready to handle a crisis. He froze when he saw the grim, accusing faces of the board members and Peterson standing at the head of the table. "Marcus," the lead director said, his voice dripping with ice, "we have some questions for you regarding a payment of $3 million made to a Dr. Alistair Finch 20 years ago." The color drained from Marcus's face. He looked around the room, his mask of control cracking, searching for an ally, an escape route. There was none. His carefully constructed world, built on a foundation of lies and obsession, was collapsing in on him. He didn't bother with denial. He simply stared at the evidence laid out on the table and gave a single, sharp nod. The security guards entered the room. Julian's justice would be swift and merciless, but it would be enacted by others. His own focus was singular, centered on a small apartment in Somerville. Back in that apartment, the story of Isabella hung in the air, a beautiful, tragic myth. Elena, Isabella, was quiet, her mind a kaleidoscope of feelings and fragmented images. The facts weren't aligning like soldiers in a row. It was more like the slow, painful return of sensation to a limb that had fallen asleep. A tingling, uncertain, and deeply emotional reawakening. Julian knew he could not force it. He had found her, and that was a miracle beyond imagining. With a heart that was both fuller and more terrified than it had been in 20 years, he stood to leave. "I should go," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "I've taken up too much of your time." He turned for the door, the simple act of walking away from her again, feeling like a physical tearing of his soul. As his hand touched the doorknob, Elena spoke, her voice small but clear, cutting through the silence. "The song." Julian froze, his back to her, every muscle in his body rigid. "What song?" he asked, not daring to turn, not daring to let this new tendril of hope take root too deeply. "The one about the sailor," Elena said, her eyes distant, looking at a memory only she could see. "The one he'd sing to her when the storms were bad, a sea shanty. I sing it to Clara sometimes when she can't sleep. I never knew where it came from. It was just there." Slowly she began to hum. It was a simple, haunting melody, an old mariner's tune, slightly off-key but filled with a deep and resonant sense of peace. For Julian Croft, the world dissolved. The peeling paint on the apartment walls, the distant wail of a city siren, the very air in his lungs. It all vanished. All that existed was that sound. It was an obscure shanty his own grandfather, a fisherman, had taught him as a boy. He had sung it to Isabella countless times on their boat, a private lullaby against the roaring of the wind and waves. No one else knew it. He turned around slowly, his face a canvas of pure, unadulterated shock and love. This wasn't a story he had told her. This wasn't a memory he had shared tonight. This was proof. This was her soul, speaking a language that bypassed the broken pathways of her mind. Tears he had thought long since dried up streamed freely down his face as he crossed the room in 2 long strides and knelt before her chair. The gesture was instinctual, an act of reverence, of surrender. He didn't touch her. He just looked at her, his heart overflowing with agony for the years they had lost, and ecstatic joy for this one perfect, undeniable moment. "Isabella," he whispered her name for the first time, not as a memory, but as a reality. The name settled over her, not with a shock, but with a sense of rightness, like finding a favorite sweater she thought she had lost forever. It felt like coming home. She reached out a trembling hand and gently, tentatively, touched his tear-streaked cheek. His skin was warm, solid, real. In that touch, in that shared, secret melody, 20 years of separation dissolved into nothing. Her memory of events was not restored. Doctors would later confirm the trauma had done permanent damage to those neural pathways. But her heart remembered. The profound, emotional truth of their love had finally, miraculously, broken through the fog. Clara watched them, tears of her own streaming down her face. She was no longer just the daughter of Elena Evans, the quiet woman with the mysterious past. She was the daughter of Isabella and Julian Croft, the living, breathing legacy of a love that had refused to be lost at sea. The days that followed were not a whirlwind. They were a maelstrom. The news of Marcus Thorne's spectacular downfall, a story of staggering betrayal involving charges of kidnapping by deception, massive fraud, and conspiracy, collided with the miraculous, seemingly impossible reappearance of Isabella Croft. The combined story was not just news, it was a modern myth, a global sensation that ignited the public imagination. And at the heart of this firestorm was their humble Somerville apartment building. The paparazzi descended not like gulls, but like vultures, their long lenses a violation, their sheer numbers creating a claustrophobic siege. The constant, frantic clicking of camera shutters became a percussive, metallic heartbeat that echoed in the stairwell. The incessant flash of strobes was a brutal, strobing assault that bled through their thin curtains day and night, erasing any distinction between private and public life. Their shouted questions, "Isabella, how did you survive? Clara, what's it like being a billionaire's daughter?" were a cacophony that stripped away the quiet, anonymous dignity they had so carefully cultivated for 2 decades. Julian shielded them from it all with the silent, overwhelming force he usually reserved for hostile corporate takeovers. He arrived in the pre-dawn gloom, not with a fleet of ostentatious limousines, but in a single armor-plated sedan flanked by 2 nondescript SUVs. His security team, men who moved with the ghostly efficiency of shadows, secured the building and created a human shield against the ravenous media. He personally escorted Isabella and Clara from the crumbling walk-up that had been both their sanctuary and their prison. As they walked down the familiar hallway for the last time, the smell of damp brick and their neighbors' cooking gave way to the scent of conditioned leather and the profound silence of the soundproofed car. They were spirited away into a new life. He took them to a sprawling, secluded estate on the North Shore, nestled on a rocky promontory that jutted into the Atlantic. It was a world away from the city's glare, a sanctuary of limestone and glass that Julian had purchased years ago in a fit of melancholy, a beautiful but empty monument to a life he thought was over. For 2 decades, it had been a place haunted by the ghost of Isabella. Now it would be her refuge. Acres of ancient, wind-sculpted trees and rolling lawns led down to a private stretch of rugged coastline. And in the gardens, thousands of wild beach roses grew in tangled, fragrant thickets, a living, breathing testament to a love he had never for a single day allowed to die. The transition was as delicate as it was disorienting. He brought in the world's best neurological specialists, not to fix her, but to understand. They explained that Elena Vance was not a lie or a delusion. She was a masterpiece of the human psyche's will to survive, a carefully constructed identity, a shell her mind had painstakingly built to protect the shattered core of Isabella from an unimaginable trauma. The goal, they counseled, was not to erase Elena, but to help her gently merge with the woman she had always been. It was a process of integration, not excavation. After weeks of quiet reflection and gentle conversations, she decided to be called Isabella again. It was not a sudden transformation, but a gentle, conscious reclaiming of the self she had lost to the sea. For Clara, the whiplash was staggering. 1 week, she was carefully dividing a small paycheck between rent, art supplies, and groceries. The next, she was staring into a walk-in pantry stocked with everything imaginable, a private chef politely inquiring about her favorite foods. But the material shock was a ripple compared to the emotional tidal wave of gaining a father. This powerful, intense man, a figure she had only read about in newspapers, was suddenly focused on her with a tender, almost reverent attentiveness that was both wonderful and overwhelming. He wanted to know everything, not as an interrogation, but with the desperate curiosity of a historian who had discovered a lost chapter of his own life. He asked about her favorite artists, her worst fears, her secret, long-deferred dream of attending the Massachusetts College of Art and Design. He listened with an intensity that made her feel like the most important person in the world. One evening, he found her in the estate's vast 2-story library, a cathedral of mahogany and leather that smelled of old paper and beeswax. She was curled in a window seat overlooking the turbulent ocean, sketching furiously in a worn notebook. Embarrassed by the raw, unpolished nature of her work, she tried to hide it. He didn't press, but simply asked, his voice gentle, "May I?" Trembling, she handed it over. He sat in a large leather armchair for nearly an hour, the only sound the soft rustle of pages turning and the distant crash of waves against the rocks below. He carefully studied her drawings, countless portraits of her mother, capturing the subtle sadness in her eyes. Rugged seascapes that mirrored her own inner turmoil. Abstract expressions of a loneliness she could never put into words. His expression was unreadable, a mask of calm concentration. Finally, he closed the book, holding it as if it were a precious manuscript. He looked up, his sea-gray eyes glistening with an emotion so profound it seemed to shake him to his core. "You have your mother's artistic soul," he said, his voice thick and raw, "and a talent that is so uniquely, powerfully your own. These are extraordinary, Clara. They are true." It was the first time in her life that anyone outside of her mother had seen the world inside her head and called it beautiful. The validation was a healing balm, a quiet mending of a part of her soul she hadn't even realized was broken. Slowly, cautiously, like the first shoots of spring after a long winter, they began to forge a new family. They had quiet dinners, not in the cavernous, intimidating formal dining hall, but in a cozy breakfast nook where they could watch the sailboats on the horizon. Julian, a man who had taken his meals in the stony, bitter silence for 20 years, now found himself laughing, a deep, rumbling sound of pure joy at Clara's wry, witty observations about their strange new life. Isabella, no longer adrift in the fog of a past she couldn't grasp, blossomed. The vacant haze in her eyes was replaced by a clear, bright serenity. She and Julian would walk for hours along their private beach, not always speaking, but simply relearning each other's rhythms, their hands clasped together with a familiarity that had defied 2 decades of separation, their footprints mingling in the wet sand before being washed away by the tide. While this fragile new life was taking root, the final brutal act of the old one played out in a sterile Boston courtroom. Marcus Thorne's trial was swift and merciless. The evidence, bank records, sworn affidavits, his own chilling confession, was insurmountable. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a quiet, ignominious end for a man whose crimes had screamed across so many lives. Julian attended only the sentencing. He felt no triumph, no flush of victory in his former friend's downfall. Looking at the hollowed-out, bitter man in the defendant's box, he saw not a monster, but the ghost of the friend he once knew, a man consumed and ultimately destroyed by his own corrosive envy. Julian's justice was not to be found in a courtroom verdict. It was at home, in the sound of his wife's laughter echoing from the garden, and in the quiet scratch of his daughter's charcoal pencil in her sketchbook.